Every Easter Sunday, there's a point in the service where we turn to each other and give each other a pretty particular Easter greeting, right? One of us turns to the other in the pew and says, "He is risen," and the other person replies, "He is risen indeed." At least that's how it's supposed to go, okay? But that is not the way it happened for me a few Easters ago, right in this church. I was seated next to someone who would describe themselves as church adjacent. They grew up religious. They left after college. They weren't terribly interested in church, but they showed up every Christmas and every Easter, as many people do, not out of great enthusiasm, but out of kindness for their family and friends. And I knew this person a little bit, so he came and sat by me. So I had Sarah to my right and this person to my left, and I turned at that particular point in the service. I extended my hand, I looked him in the eye and said, "He is risen." And he grabbed my hand and looked me back in the eye and said, "Good for him." And I had never heard this before, and I'm a little bit slow, and so I thought maybe this is a Baptist thing. And so I chased him down after the service. And in the atrium, he was trying to get out as fast as he could and ran to him in the breezeway. And I said, "What does that mean?" And he said, "I think you know what it means." He said, "I've been in church for a long time. I went to a Christian school. I lived in a dorm with a lot of theology majors who stayed up late at night talking about different theories of the atonement and the resurrection, talking about the reason that it was good news. And it does sound to me," he said, "like a really good moment in Jesus's life, but I still can't figure out for the life of me what on earth it has to do with me." You've been there, haven't you? There are moments when you've been told that the quality of your life should have sort of a spiritual flavor to it. And yet pretty much everything you do in the places that you put your feet every day feels strangely unspiritual. You're slogging through to make enough money just to pay the bills and trying to get groceries and manage your calendar of after-school events. You're struggling to sleep at night because some of your most important relationships are caught up in grievances that neither of you actually have words to talk about. You're doing every spiritual thing that you know to do, and yet you experience the judgment of God and the expectation of God much more than the favor of God, because you're convinced that you need to earn God's attention by doing more good things. You have tightness in your chest and your shoulders because you're white-knuckling almost everything in your life because you feel that it's your job to hold it all together. Am I getting close for some of you, or do I need to pay you a copay? On those days, if somebody said, "He's risen," almost all of us, if we were honest, would be tempted to say, "Good for him." Because when life feels like that, what we need isn't just a remembrance that Jesus rose again. What we need is a sense that new life is actually possible for us. That's what's captivated my attention about Colossians. We don't know a whole lot about the context of the church at Colossae, which was merciful to me because the commentaries were shorter. But what we do know is that it was a town in modern-day Turkey that was along a trade route. We know that it was pretty religiously diverse. There was a little paganism sprinkled in here, some cults, some religious schools, some mystery chasers. There are some Jews and others who were converting to Judaism and wondering where Christianity, which was at that time just a small offshoot of Judaism, fit into the demands of a pretty already crowded religious marketplace. So in other words, the Colossian church was at the intersection of a lot of different visions of the good life. Some of what they heard required strict discipline. Some of what they heard required them to chase mysteries. Almost all of what they heard required them to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and collect as many experiences and possessions as possible in order to achieve a vision of the good life and hold their world together. Does any of that sound familiar to you? Paul hasn't actually been to this church, but it appears that he's heard from the founder of the church that this is a group of people who were used to hearing a lot of messages about personal responsibility, who wanted sincerely to do what was right, but who were dizzy from all the spiritual instruction that they were getting and wondering, what really does the resurrection of Jesus have to do with my life? And so Paul starts his letter there and his answer to these sort of pastoral concerns, not with more religious things to do on their checklist, but interestingly, by reminding the church of who Jesus is. You just heard it read better than I can, but it won't stop me from reading it anyway. He said, the Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, things that are visible, things that are invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through Christ and for him. He's before all things, and in him all things hold together. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, things on earth and in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. This is who Jesus is. And then Paul turns his attention to what this actually makes possible for the church. He says, once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. But now, Christ has reconciled you by his physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. In other words, God's not just after your effort or your hard work or your attempts to feel worthy. Through the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus, God is putting what's wrong with the world right again and inviting you into a new way of being human as Jesus was. The resurrection is important for your life and for my life because we're embedded in a culture and a world that's crying out for new life. You heard Elizabeth just pray about these things all around us. Stuff is not as it should be. There's injustice and violence and oppression and war. We can look at our neighborhoods. Just look out, not even on the news channel, just look out our front window and see poverty and racism and food scarcity and addiction and families that are divided by hurts that always feel too big to repair. And that's only the stuff that we can see. Not mentioning the things we can't see. Hidden hurts that you and I don't talk about or even have words for, and even if we did, wouldn't mention, because we're quite sure that if we did, the people who are holding their lives together would reject us. Paul's message here is freeing for those of us who feel like we have to hold it all together, because he's saying that Jesus already has that job. That's a nice one to take off our resume. Our job is simply, in Paul's words, to persist in our faith, to nourish the life of Christ that's already inside the believer. So if I can, I'll just pause here and say that this isn't an invitation to do more stuff, because this ultimately is really, truly not about just what you can do, which is sort of a reality check, I think, for those of us who are type A. God is recreating the world, and that'll get done whether you're diligent or not. Before God gives you a responsibility, before God gives you a mission, before God asks you how you're stewarding your gifts, God looks at you and says, through Christ, you're part of the family, chosen and dearly loved. That's a pretty big advantage of a risen Jesus. The God who took on flesh is now in his physical body, seated at the right hand of God, hearing our prayers and the prayers that the Spirit prays for us that we would never be smart enough to pray, advocating for us and inviting us through our physical bodies to take on, first, the family resemblance, the humanity of Jesus, and second, the family business, which is to renew the world. This brings a whole new set of possibilities. And so, because Paul knows that the church will wonder what it actually looks like to live out this kind of life, he tries in Colossians 3 to describe the side effects of God's grace in our relationships. And as I read through this passage, I can see at least 4 relationships that Paul says will be renewed as the Spirit puts roots down into our personalities, into our habits, into our dispositions. The first relationship is with our hungers. Paul writes, "Put to death, therefore, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. Because of these, the wrath of God is coming. You used to walk in these ways in the life that you once lived. Do you ever think about what you're hungry for? Some of you are thinking all the time. I don't mean brunch. What I'm talking about in hunger isn't just about your stomach. What I'm talking about is something that your heart deeply wants. And if I asked you, I imagine pretty much all of us could identify a few things that we really want to be true of our life. Some of you might say, I want to have a good marriage, or I want satisfying friendships. And that may be true, but here's the tricky thing. Hungers aren't just the things that we say we want. They're the things that our habits reach for. And let's face it, our habits are not always reaching for the things that we say we want. If I say I want to have a good marriage, but I don't stay curious about my spouse, I'm going to stop seeing and knowing them, and they're going to know it. If I say I want to be a generous person, but I'm not starting now, habits of giving, I'm going to grow older, never having learned to get free of my possessions. If I say I want to have really good friendships, but I nearly never reach out to others, I will live resenting the loneliness I have chosen. This isn't always true, so hear the disclaimer. But most of us at the very end of the day get the life that we practiced for. We exercise and we eat healthy foods so that we can practice for a healthy life later. We show up for our friends so that we can practice having durable relationships. You'll rarely meet somebody who had an affair who didn't practice for years online. You'll rarely meet someone who's stingy, who didn't put down roots in their own selfishness years and years and years before. And this is the more haunting thing, you'll almost never meet someone who would say they wanted their life to turn out that way. But it's not our hopes that dictate our character. It's our hungers and our habits. People who are at home in the new creation, says Paul, start to hunger and crave the things that God craves. Instead of objectifying and using others, we'll consider them as much-loved siblings. Instead of seeing our impulses as mandates to be followed, we'll see them as things that we can steward as we align our life toward Christ, so that the healthy thing, even though it feels unnatural at first, grows to become, over time, a reflex of love. The second thing that the resurrection has implications for is our words. It seems that Paul's writing to this congregation when they're pretty young. And he seems to notice that as these people are coming together, they have different convictions and they have different skill sets and they have different backgrounds. And so as they come together, these things start to clash. And so they start to steward their words and opinions in ways that are argumentative or not quite truthful or belittling to people that they disagreed with. Aren't you grateful that that stopped at the early church? I mean, that'd be a shame if we ever did that today. In this context, Paul writes, starting in verse 8 of Colossians 3, "But now you must also rid yourselves of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, filthy language from your lips. Don't lie to each other, since you've taken off your old self with its practices and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator." When I've read this in the past, I've pretty often read it to communicate something really simple. Don't use swear words and don't lie. And that's not a bad place to start, but you and I both know that we can do a lot with our words that isn't lying and isn't swearing, but still isn't becoming of the character of Christ. We can use our words to make ourselves look good at somebody else's expense. We can use our words to dodge responsibility for something that we legitimately have done wrong. We can use our words to taint the reputation of others without ever directly addressing our beef with them. When we feel insecure, most of us spew anger and venom and unkind thoughts on the people closest to us that we love the most, because when we're at war with ourselves, we will make casualties of everyone around us. Our relationship with words is a really hard one to get right because all of us have tendencies baked into our personalities that get in the way. Some of us, in the name of just being honest and expressing ourselves or venting stress, run over other people with careless words that are rude and demeaning and insensitive. And others of us, in the name of keeping the peace, lie not by what we say, but by what we leave unsaid. We never confront others directly because we're just not sure it's worth it, but we'll tell our friends about who's offended us, just not in the presence of the person who did it. Ruh-roh. We didn't learn that from Jesus, did we? What Paul is saying here is that a Christ-like relationship with words is this simple. Say what's true. The challenge is that the only way to saying what's true leads through love. A relationship with our words that ripples out from the new life of Christ reframes what our words are for. They're for affirming in others the way that they've reflected Christ to you. They're for confessing honestly where you've fallen short. They're for caringly confronting others about ways that they've hurt you. They're for speaking openly about where God's meeting you or where you're feeling disappointment because it seems God did not meet you in the way you expected. Those are a lot of good ways of using our words, and it gives us a lot of room to keep using words. But if you want to know how you're doing with this week, pay attention to when you're talking to people, and maybe especially pay attention to when you're talking about people that aren't in the room. And ask yourself, why am I doing this? And instead of asking, are my words sinful? A lot of us do this. We say, was it sin? Wesleyans don't ask, was it sin? I'm convinced Christians probably generally shouldn't ask if it's sin, but Wesleyans never ask, is it sin, when they're deciding whether to include habits in their life or words in a sentence. The right question isn't, is it sin? Let me get as close to sin as I can without going to hell. The right question is, does it promote holiness? When in doubt, leave it out. Okay, move on. Third, the resurrection changes our relationship with power. For all we don't know about the Colossian church, we do know that they lived in a society that revolved around a person's ability to get status for themselves, any chance they had to sort of elbow into the community, even of faith, and pull rank. They were trained to take advantage of it. And so Paul writes, here, there's no Gentile or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian or Scythian or slave or free, but Christ is all and is in all. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, with kindness, with humility, with gentleness and patience. In other words, rather than seeing your identity markers, your religious upbringing or political affiliation, your status, your privilege, your lack of privilege, as a reason that you're excused from loving other people, see those as things that God is aware of as he calls you to give your life away. My goodness, the world is hungry for churches full of people like that. The world is hungry for churches where people of every tribe and nation and tongue have a place at the table. Churches that work for the immigrant and the refugee and the unborn and the elderly. Churches where those in addiction find healing, those who are parentless find homes, and those who are discarded find a place to be loved and use their gifts. Churches where households and families are open enough to the people in their neighborhoods that other people who are suspicious of Christians know what it looks like when love possesses a household. This is the kind of church that serves as a powerful witness to a culture that's convinced that Christians are more in love with our religion than our neighbor. If you want to start that this week, think about how you can use your time, energy, finances, attention, all the things you don't have enough of, to quietly elevate somebody else. In the kingdom of God, the best use of power is to give it away. The final thing I notice is that the resurrection changes our relationship with forgiveness. Paul says, bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against anyone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you, and over all these virtues put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. There are, frankly, times when I wonder, even in the church, if forgiveness is really possible. Forgiveness is an important teaching, it's central to the life of Jesus. And yet so few of us actually have very good practice in it. I've heard from countless Christians, even in this church, who say sometimes by their words and sometimes by their actions, if not with their words, once somebody offends me, once somebody wrongs me, I'm done with them. If I can step out of the pulpit for a second and just look you eye to eye, that part of your personality won't be with you in heaven. It would be good to practice getting it out now. God's just too big to endure such a small person, is he not? Okay, back to the pulpit. Most of us already know, actually, that it's a good idea to forgive, right? There's just something else that's more appealing or that has us in its grip. Sometimes we don't forgive because it avoids us getting hurt. Sometimes it's because we want to prove that we take the offense seriously, and we feel like if we forgive them too quickly, we're soft on sin. Sometimes it's because we get a lot of bad advice from people who are frankly just as bad or worse at forgiveness than we are. I talked to someone here who gave me permission to share this story. There's a young couple in our church who got engaged, and the woman asked her mother, what's your approach to forgiveness in marriage? And the mom said, married 41 years. She said, I pretend to forgive him. And then I bring up what he's done wrong every once in a while when I need to win an argument. And I thought that was pretty funny until I realized how true it rings with the reason that you and I often want to hold on to unforgiveness. Often we want to hold on to smaller grievances, not because of the depth of the wound, but because holding on to the grievance enables us to feel power over the one offending us because we feel like they owe us. And it's also one of the cheapest ways to buy a relationship with other people is to complain about someone else that's not the two of you. We didn't learn that from Jesus. And if we're not careful, we'll claim to be moral people and even feel that our unforgiveness is part of us standing on the moral high ground, even though, personally, I can think of nothing more immoral than living in unforgiveness. Fortunately, that's not the way it has to be. There really is another way. The one Paul talks about, bearing with one another in love, choosing when we're offended not to nourish the virus of grievance, but to do whatever we can to heal, to confront dysfunction, to hold boundaries, but also make no mistake, to release other people from the debt that we've been feeling that they owe us for so long, and in the process, to find out that we're the ones that become free. Frankly, I've wondered what to do with this message this week because it seems to me like Paul is speaking out of both sides of his mouth. On the one hand, he's saying that we're relieved of duty in our striving to hold the world together. Christ, who is our life, is drawing all things to himself, holding all things together, including our lives, without us having to anxiously strive for righteousness. But on the other hand, Paul then describes a way of living in this passage that's so other than the way that you and I normally live. And so because I have a great capacity to misunderstand the Bible, on my first reading this week, I walked away thinking I just have a lot of stuff to do. And so I went back into religious achievement mode, thinking what many of us have thought. Jesus died and was miserable for me, and now it's my turn to be miserable for him by doing a whole bunch of stuff I don't want to do to prove I'm grateful. Thanks be, no. He is risen, good for him. But really, what does the resurrection have to do with me? Here's what it has to do with you. The resurrection means that in Christ, life has broken in, and the culture of death will not overcome it. Because of Jesus's life, because of Jesus's death, because of Jesus's resurrection, the door is always open to a new and durable kind of life that God's bringing in the world and wants to bring through the church and inside of you, a life that reframes our relationship with our hunger and our words and our power and our stewardship of forgiveness, not one that emerges from white knuckle perfectionism and clutching as tightly onto our life and our disciplines as we possibly possibly can, but from being the child of a God who sincerely wants to help us bear the family resemblance. I don't know how this works, frankly. I wish I did. But I can tell you that this kind of life actually is a real possibility. There are, even in this church, stories of people who have overcome addiction, who have completely changed the way that they relate to their spouse, who have let go of bitterness and anger and self-righteousness that they've held on to for years, and who can tell you that they tried to do it through white-knuckle efforts, sometimes for decades, but were unsuccessful. But then they tried something different. They said yes to the quiet voice of the Holy Spirit that they had missed in all their striving, and heard the Spirit say, in a moment, and then another, and then another, in Christ the door is open to a grace-shaped life, and then they walk through it. And as they did, the Spirit reframed their habits and changed their hungers, and even when obedience didn't feel natural to them, helped them say a quiet yes that multiplied into more yeses, that multiplied into more yeses, until gradually it hardened into a character that over time just said yes when God asked. Before, they would have said, he's risen, good for him. But today they say, he's risen indeed, because I couldn't ever have done this on my own. I've tried. That's what resurrection life looks like, and it's a good idea, not just because it makes God happy, though that's nice too, but because this is an integrated life. This is a life that holds together, and it's, at the end of the day, the only kind of life that lasts, because it's not just something that you whip up. It's the life of Christ in you, reaching through you to a world that needs it. So I know I'm talking this morning to one or two of you probably, who are white-knuckling it through your life, thinking it all depends on you, and yet you're weary of over-functioning and feel like even when you're at the top of your game, your life is splintering and you're more tense than ever. I know there are some of us in this church who the Spirit has been working on, sometimes for a moment, sometimes for a decade, who want more than anything a life that holds together, not an easy life or a smooth life, but a life in which all of our relationships, all of our efforts, all of our work, all of our rest, all of our dreams, all of our hopes come together to receive and pass on the new life that's only found in Jesus. If that's you, hear the good news. The door is open. And this morning could be the start of that kind of life. Sometimes an altar call happens on Sunday morning, and sometimes it happens on Thursday in the grocery checkout. I'm not sure which one this is, so I'll let you decide. What I'm going to do in just a minute is hold space for us to be quiet before the Lord and reflect on 4 key questions that emerge from Colossians. The first is, where in your life are you relying on your own power to hold it together? The second is, which of these 4 relationships, hungers, words, power, or forgiveness, do you need God's help with? The third is, what would be the first step towards surrendering to God this morning? And the fourth, because this is a call not just to you, but to y'all, is who will you tell before lunch today who can really, really help you? We'll hold some space for silence.